For our next session, we have Adapt, Reflect, Repeat, moving quickly to keep library services running. And this is presented by Ken Wierzbowski, Erin Sharwell, and Dana Laird, all from SUNY Brockport. After obtaining a bachelor's degree in English, Dana Laird started her career in the private sector, working as a technical lead, then business analyst at Xerox Corporation. She returned to her alma mater, the University at Buffalo, where she earned her MLS while working full-time. Dana began working at the Drake Memorial Library at SUNY Brockport as a circulation clerk, then as a circulation manager before attaining her current role as technical services librarian in the spring of 2020. In this role, Dana's primary focus is managing electronic resources and serials, including collection decisions and troubleshooting access issues. Ken Wierzbowski is an associate librarian at SUNY Brockport and currently serves in the role of systems librarian at the Drake Memorial Library. Ken also oversees the Drake Library's makerspace, serves as EIT liaison for the library, and is a member of the SLC Improvements and Enhancements Working Group. Ken earned his MLS and BA in Film Studies from the University at Buffalo. Erin Sharwell is head of library operations at SUNY Brockport, overseeing technical services, circulation systems, and interlibrary loan. Prior to SUNY, she was head of technical services at Coastal Carolina University. And feel free to take it away, folks.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Erin Sharwell. I am head of library operations at SUNY Brockport. Like Jill said, I oversee technical services, circulation, systems, and interlibrary loan. I'm here with Ken Wierzbowski, systems librarian, and Dana Laird, technical services librarian, who are the other library operations librarians. And we're going to talk a bit about what we did when we reopened last fall and in response to the current pandemic. Take it away, Ken.
Good morning, everyone. As Erin said, my name is Ken. I'm the systems librarian, and one of the main issues that we came across is that it became very clear that we were going to remain open. So this brought up so many logistical issues. How are we going to maintain social distancing practices in our building? We don't have swipe card access at the Drake Library, so we really can't keep track of how many people are in the building at one time. And there really wasn't a feasible way to have somebody monitoring the doorway with a people counter or something like that. So we had to look inward, and we had to do it quickly. We didn't have a budget really for any special equipment or anything like that. And so just looking at what we had available, we already had a subscription to SpringShare products and LibCal. The Seats module, we had an add-on with that. That was a tiny budgetary thing that we could eke out, and Erin will talk about that more in a little bit. But I also had a number of Raspberry Pi computers hanging around from the makerspace and digital signage that I had set up in the library entryway. And at first I thought, okay, maybe there's something out there with like a webcam and like there's a smart AI thing, you know, like as a people counter, we can get this live readout of how many people are in the building at a given time. But that was not well developed, what I found out there. And again, time was of the essence. So what I ended up doing and what we ended up coming out with the solution for was, let's use these systems together. So we closed our building to community users and had only students, faculty, and staff have access, and that they had to make a reservation with the LibAnswers product. So that was one way of getting everybody, you know, on the same path and limiting the number of people that would be entering the building to begin with, and they'd need a reservation. And on top of that, then I ended up just using like a swipe card reader, which I'll talk about on the next slide, to do like a very primitive contact tracing concept. And these systems weren't linked together in any way, but this overall psychological effect of you have to have a reservation and guiding people, their entry and exit to the building, you know, made this part of the process. You have to swipe your ID, you have to have a reservation. So again, I went high tech at first with looking out and seeing what was out there with all these smart AI things, and it just wasn't going to happen. So I wrote a small script in Python just to write the swipe card data to a local spreadsheet file, and then I would back that up with a script I found to a secure Google Sheet. The only data on these swipe cards is a unique number. There's no personal identifying information or anything like that. And I would make sure to purge that after 14 days so that we'd have the most privacy and the most secure way to protect our students' privacy. Another neat thing I set up was Real VNC, which allowed me to log into the Raspberry Pis remotely and do all the management stuff I needed to do there. So we would have a swipe in and a swipe out. And I do want to specify that, we weren't asked for this data or anything like that from admin, but we just wanted to be thinking ahead, especially in those early days, not knowing exactly how everything was going to pan out. We wanted to make sure that we had all of our bases covered, and we would have this as an added bonus on top of it, just in case. And hopefully in post-pandemic times, we could even use this to, gather attendance stats or something like that for library events. But just something that we wanted to have just in case we were asked. All right, another thing too, now that we had the library closed to the public, reservation only, is that we had a much smaller access to our physical materials. There were a lot of students that couldn't come to campus. We're staying away actively. So how can we increase access to these physical materials? So we already do book chapter scanning requests through Iliad, through DocDel. So we decided to lean on that a little more, emphasize that, advertise that through our FAQ that we had, again, through SpringShare on our website, and tie it with some existing services. So not all of our staff members knew how to use Iliad, just the select interlibrary loan staff. So how could we scale this up so we could also get our circulation staff and other tech services staff involved to anticipate this higher volume of requests? So again, I looked inward to see what we already have, and there we have Primo, of course. Why not leverage this awesome tool to our advantage? And we had this system called Mockform, which is very similar to Google Forms. And then again, the SpringShare LibAnswers ticketing system, which we already had a subscription with. So how did I mash all of these things together? First, I made a form in Mockform, again, very similar to Google Forms. What is nice is that you can pass data into the form fields via the URL with Mockform. So that's already setting off some bells in my mind of the possibilities. So I created a general electronic service in Primo for book chapter scanning, put the string, the open URL string in so that it could pass all the metadata once a student logged in and clicked on the request button. After they click that button, it would create an entry. So Mockform would send an email with all of that metadata, and the email would be sent to LibAnswers, where it would create a ticket. So this way we had end-to-end process, and the advantage of putting it into LibAnswers was also that none of the requests would be lost in the mix. If we just had requests coming in via email or something like that, it would be a case of who's on first. This way, one staff member would claim the book chapter scan request and see it through end to end. And our circulation staff was already using LibAnswers and the ticketing system, so there wouldn't be a learning curve really. So this drastically improved our capability of being able to process book chapter scans. So I'm going to pass it along now to Erin, who is going to talk about some of the other issues that we had to deal with during the pandemic.
All right, so I'm going to be a little bit mindful of time and make sure I leave enough time for Dana. So I'm going to go through some of this pretty quick, but I'm happy to answer questions about it at the end. So one of the things that we knew we needed to do when we found out we were going to reopen for fall semester is to make it as safe for our patrons as possible. We needed to develop a reservation system basically to control who was in the library and how they were using the space, to make sure that we were able to enforce our masking and distancing requirements of the college. So one thing that we needed to do, because our computers were closer than 6 feet together, we disabled every other computer. So only every other computer was going to be available to be reserved. And we also took away a lot of chairs in the library. We only left one seat at every table to disallow group study in the library. Like Ken mentioned, we had already had a LibCal subscription, so we calculated how many reservable seats we were going to need, and we added that 200 seat add-on to our LibCal subscription. Next slide, Ken. So this is what it looked like. The upper left, you can see this is what our website would look like. People could see the different types of reservable spaces we had available and directly go to the type that they needed. The bottom left is what that reservation screen looked like. Each reservable space started with the location and then a description of the reservable space and whether or not it had an outlet, because we had a lot of students in the building who needed to plug in their laptops. There's a little info button to the left of each of those spaces, and that's what takes you to the window on the upper right of your screen. I took a picture of every single space that we made reservable in the library, uploaded it to each of those reservation links, and put as much description in there as possible, just so I wanted to make sure that patrons really understood what type of space they were reserving. We also had an FAQ for the new services and policies and procedures we had in place for reopening for fall semester. One of those was, how can I find my reservable space? So I made maps for every floor of the library. It was too busy to put every single number on them, so I put ranges, and then the reservable spaces were numbered in such a way that it was very intuitive to find. So these maps seem to work well for our patrons. Next slide, Ken. So how it went. Students mostly found the reservation system easy and the spaces findable. The two big problems that we seem to have were, first was a kind of a spring share problem where the end time of the reservation was not really obvious. You had to scroll down below the grid in order to find it. And even though we put some language on our reservation page to explain that, people tend to kind of gloss over, printed words sometimes. And so they would end up making, several 1 hour block reservations rather than one continuous reservation. So I tried to explain to patrons every time I helped them to try and get over that hurdle. The other thing was that even with all of the information on our website, in our newsletter, and signage when you walked into the building, people still didn't always understand that they needed to have a reservation for a space. And so that they would sit down at any available space. And this became a particular problem with our computers, which were limited and in high demand. Someone would sit down, and then the person who had that space reserved would come in, see someone at their spot, and rather than ask them to move or let us know, they would just sit down at another open space. That person who had that space reserved would come in, and et cetera, until someone let us know, and we had to fix that domino effect. We did also see some students who didn't like the 4-hour time limit, commuter students who like to study for long hours in between classes, or people who lived on campus that wanted to get away from roommates. We did have a few repeat violators of our masking and distancing requirements. This was one of the reasons we wanted to have a reservation system, so that we had some contact information associated with each of the spaces in case we did need to report someone to student conduct. Overall, though, it was really useful for having some control over how people use the building. Next slide, Ken. Another thing that we needed to do is take our high contact services and make them lower no contact, as needed. And holds pickup and ILL pickup was one of the things that really lent itself to that no contact model. We didn't have any budget to do this, so we just had to, the other things we're talking about here, really use what we already had in place. I wanted to make sure that the access was as, easy as possible, that, things were as streamlined as possible. So what I ended up doing was we already had just a couple banks of lockers upstairs that were in disuse that we repurposed for this contactless pickup. We moved them down to our entryway. We took the ALMA holds notifications that, let people know that their holds were ready. And we put the link to the locker reservation right there in the email so they could reserve a locker, as soon as they got the notification that their hold was ready. And then every morning staff would fill the lockers at opening. Next slide, Ken. So this is what that looked like. Upper left are, poor, disused lockers, and downstairs, bottom left, cleaned up. We put signs on everyone. This was nice because since they were in our entryway, they kind of acted as their own self-advertising. People could walk into the building and see that we had this contactless service available. You also can't really see it that well, because in this picture, but they're in between two sets of doors. So beyond the lockers are our inner doors, but we also have a set of exterior doors behind them. And what this enabled us to do was to continue to offer this contactless pickup service, even when the library was closed. We closed last Thanksgiving when we went to virtual classes, and we didn't reopen until last week, but we were able to offer that contactless pickup the entire time we were closed. Every time staff was in the building, we would leave those exterior doors unlocked so people could access their items. Upper right is just what that reservation screen looked like. Again, it's the seats add-on to LibCal. People would reserve them for an entire day. Lower left is what the interior of the lockers looked like. We made sure to put single books into envelopes and multiple books into paper bags because the realm studies showed that the paper held onto the virus less well than other materials, but we also did sanitize regularly. Next slide, please, Ken. So this is how it went. It's mostly going well. We did have to make a couple of adjustments. We needed to add more of a buffer in the morning because we found that patrons would really come at the very beginning of their reserved time to pick up their items, and sometimes they weren't always ready. So we needed to under promise and make that start time later to give our staff time to get everything ready for the day. We also needed to expand the pickup range. We experimented with having half-day pickups like morning or afternoon, and people really needed a longer time than that. We did have a problem sometimes with patrons not picking up their items on time. There would still be books left in the lockers at the end of the day, and we needed to get those out because the locker needed to be used the next day. So we would have to contact patrons and reserve a locker for them. One problem that I didn't anticipate was, it's I think a human behavior problem. There's a list of lockers and people tend to choose the first one that's available. So locker 1 was always in use. Locker 2 was sometimes in use, but lockers 3 through 24 were very seldom in use. So we really haven't been able to utilize those lockers as well as we could because it is a self-serve program. We would have to maintain more control over them in order to distribute that more evenly. Again, this did allow us to continue offering the pickup when the library was closed. And also because we are a relatively low volume of request library, we were able to accommodate not only ALMA pickup hold requests, but also people could just call us, chat us, email us and say, hey, can you pull a book from the stacks and put it in a locker for me? And we can do that as well. So it's been very successful. All right, now I'm going to turn it over to Dana.
While Dana's unmuting, I will just remind our presenters that we're brushing up against questions. So just keep that in mind.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so thanks for bearing with me. So due to the pandemic, we face the need to provide access to our collections to patrons who were suddenly teaching and learning remotely. So our electronic collection, which has always obviously been very important, it became even more critical during this time. Since a bulk of our collection budget went to electronic resources, it was apparent early on these resources would be greatly impacted by a reduced budget. And since we knew there would be a dramatic reduction to our budget, but we didn't know what that percentage would be, we initially estimated it would be about 20%. Additionally, compounding that was during the summer, we had some of our funds that were unused and unencumbered swept without our knowledge beforehand. So this put a lot more pressure on us to make cancellation decisions quickly and consider things for cancellation that we normally wouldn't consider. Next slide, please. Okay, so in order to make these difficult decisions, we relied on quantitative and qualitative data. So we already had some vendors set up on sushi harvesting within Alma, but we still had many to add. So with Ken, our system librarian, with his help, we were able to add additional vendors, which just makes that process a lot more streamlined instead of us having to go to vendor admin sites and download usage data from there. So we used cost per use as our main factor identifying likely resources to cancel or to let expire. In addition to that, we used qualitative data. We adapted a library liaison feedback form that was developed at Geneseo and provided that to our liaison librarians. We got useful information from that, and it was really good to start that dialogue amongst all the librarians and professionals as to what our critical resources are for our user groups, in addition to our cost per use data. Next slide, please. So looking back, we should have been a bit more aggressive and assuming an even larger percentage of a reduction cut. There were some resources that were on the calendar year cycle that we had to let expire that we would have preferred not to. Also, many resources had cost information from a previous year in Alma. So rather than using built-in tools within analytics, I created analyses to capture that data, then exported it to Excel and did some further work there to get cost per use. So making sure the PO line in Alma is up to date and has the correct years, like the current price that you are paying, makes it a lot more streamlined to just be able to use the cost per use information stored right within that you can pull right from analytics. So we also continued to configure sushi vendors. And what we're going to start doing is once a year, any vendor that we have that wasn't previously on sushi, we're going to just look at the list again and see if maybe now they're a sushi vendor, and if so, add them. It'll just be a once a year review. And we'll also add any new vendors if we're able to at the time of vendor setup in Alma. On a positive note, this really fostered dialogue between all the different members of the library to identify our critical needs and to try to make sure we retain what is most needed during this time. Next slide, please. So in addition to that, another tool that we benefited from during this pandemic was Microsoft Teams. Before the pandemic, it was used within a few groups in the library, but it had just begun to be more broadly used within the entire library. So at the beginning of the pandemic, we were using Zoom a lot for our meetings, but due to security concerns, we went away from that and decided to incorporate Microsoft Teams more. Next slide, please. Microsoft Teams has become a critical tool to allow communication one-on-one, within groups, and among different groups within the library and throughout campus. That product is well integrated for institutions that are already using Microsoft Office Suite. It's easy to create meetings and just have the embedded link to join the meeting right in there when you schedule the meeting right through Microsoft Teams. It also provides a way to connect during this time when we were all working remotely. We had a lot of critical decisions, our collection development review, and meetings where we had to make changes to our policies and procedures, especially public-facing one during this time. We also used Teams to communicate our availability, so people knew who was working in the office and who was working remotely. And it was additionally used over the summer while a team of us created an anti-oppression LibGuide. There are files that you can update as a team at the same time and asynchronously right through the Teams module. So it was very well integrated for the purposes of that project. So in these ways and others, Microsoft Teams has been essential in maintaining a sense of team and sharing information during this unique time. So thank you for listening to Ken and Erin and I, and we would like to open it up for any questions.
All right, we've got about 4 minutes. I see that Ken has been answering some of the ones that were posted in the Q&A, but if anyone has any more, feel free to throw them in. And just another reminder that all of these sessions are being recorded and all registrants will receive the recordings afterwards. And also thank you for that presentation. All of everything that was shown was really cool and innovative, and one of the few bright sides to this whole pandemic has just been the innovation and creativity that can carry over to library services afterwards.
This is Erin. I'm seeing that a couple of questions came through about lockers, and I did answer them in the Q&A, but security was a concern, but we decided it was an acceptable risk. The lockers were not locked, but we did have a security camera pointed at the area, and the lockers were only accessible when staff were in the building. And yes, items were already checked out when they were put in the lockers, so patrons could just grab them and go.
And it looks like since some of these were answered and there aren't that many new ones coming in, if any of you want to read aloud some of the ones that have come in with the answers, that might be helpful to some folks.
Sure, I can.
Folks who will watch the recordings later.
Sure, no problem. One question that I answered is, why did we use mock form specifically? And honestly, it was just familiarity and needing to move quickly. The person who asked the question asked, oh, could you use LibWizard, maybe the SpringShare API to make it all a little more seamless? Probably and definitely. And that's something awesome to look into. But we were really crunched there for that in the early days to get something in place quickly so we could open up our doors. But that's an awesome suggestion to build on. But yeah, really just being familiar with these specific tools and running with it.
I see that there's a question here about the book chapter scanning policies and copyright compliance. This is just an ongoing conversation that we have with our staff. We try to, keep to the general, fair use wisdom of no more than a chapter or 10%, which is kind of what we've always done.
And quickly about the lockers that use the library card to open that are locked, that would be awesome and amazing. I wish, hopefully someday we'll get something fancy like that. But yeah, we just had to move. That's really what I want to underscore, is just we had to move quickly to come up with something. But
yeah. We had no budget at all. So whatever we had on hand, the scanners that Ken used for our Raspberry Pi were, taken from our, service desk, extras. We didn't buy anything for any of these projects except for the seats subscription.
All right. Well, it looks like it is 11 o'clock now. So I'd once again like to thank the three of you for presenting. And I think we are now ready for our first break.
Thank you, Jill.
Thank you.
Thanks.